Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this sixth day of 6th of June. Well, it is a beautiful day out here in Brisbane, and it's 16 degrees and sunny. Isn't it just so wonderful to look outside around this time of the year? It is not very cold, so early in the morning. This is what Brisbane's all about. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today we have for you all the news update plus some of the commentaries that we might add on, and then we'll take a look at some of the functions and events taking place right here in Brisbane. First of all, let's take a look at the tragic incident in India. How did those three cranes collide?
The deadly crash took place in Balasore in Odisha state in India's east. The exact sequence of events is still being investigated, but this is what authorities know so far. A passenger train, the Coromandel Express, was travelling from Kolkata to the southern city of Chennai when it collided with a stationary goods train. At the time of impact, it was estimated to be travelling at 140 kilometres an hour. The derailed carriages spilling across multiple rail lines when another train, the Howrah Superfast Express, travelling north in the opposite direction, then collided with the derailed carriages.
So there you are. There's an enactment of what really happened, but we will look at that in details as the reports come to hand. Well, the other news is the very big news which everyone's talking about is Kathleen Folbig and how she's been pardoned after all these years.
Great, thank you. This morning at 9:30 I met with the Governor. I recommended that the Governor should exercise the royal prerogative of mercy and grant Ms Folbig an unconditional pardon. The Governor agreed.
5 weeks ago, a second inquiry into Kathleen Folbig's 2003 conviction determined there was now reasonable doubt as to her guilt. Following sustained pressure by Folbig's supporters, the New South Wales Attorney-General agreed to act before Tom Bathurst's findings are handed down.
Considering Mr Bathurst's conclusion that he is firmly of the view that there is reasonable doubt as to Ms Folbig's guilt, I consider that his reasons establish exceptional circumstances of the kind that weigh heavily in favour of the grant of a free pardon, and that in the interest of justice Ms Folbig should be released from custody as soon as possible.
Ambulance emergency. I need an ambulance. My baby's not breathing.
In 2003, Kathleen Folbig was sentenced to 40 years for the murder of 3 of her children, Patrick, Sarah and Laura, and the manslaughter of Caleb. With no direct evidence to drive the prosecution's case, the Crown relied heavily on the coincidence of 4 children dying in the same family and the words in Kathleen Folbig's diaries. It was enough to secure a conviction.
Mrs Folbig wishes me to say on her behalf that she is innocent of killing her children or in any way harming her children. She's instructed me to lodge an appeal immediately, and that will be done today.
On appeal, the conviction was upheld, but the sentence reduced to 30 years. All the while, Kathleen Folbig maintained her innocence.
Are you responsible for the death of Caleb?
No.
Are you responsible for the death of Patrick?
No.
In 2015, Folbig's lawyers called for a review into her convictions, based on new findings by forensic pathologist Professor Stephen Cordner. 3 years later, New South Wales Attorney-General Mark Speakman recommended an inquiry be established to review the convictions.
This is not a decision or a recommendation that I have made lightly. It has weighed on me and it has been an immensely difficult decision.
Former Chief Justice of the District Court, Reg Blanche, was appointed to head the inquiry.
The Crown case relied wholly on circumstantial evidence.
Folbig's former husband, Craig, opposed her release.
This chapter unfolding now, we feel, was unnecessary and most definitely unwelcome.
In 2019, the Blanche inquiry delivered its findings.
After an extensive public inquiry, Commissioner Blanche found that there was no doubt about Ms Folbig's guilt. and indeed he thought that the evidence before him actually reinforced his view that Ms Folby was guilty of those 4 homicides and that malicious infliction of harm.
So there you go. Is it too little too late of the case? But, you know, many times when you look at these kind of things in detail and some of the facts coming out after so many years, that just raises a question that how many other people would have gone through the similar situations and probably never had come back because that was it. Judgment was passed and that went. What actually happened, the truth many times might not come out in many cases, not only in this case, because it's very hard to determine. There are circumstantial evidence, which is what the judgments are based on, and many times they cannot be true or they might not be true, even though all the evidence points that way. So, you know, it's food for thought as to the legal systems and the way that it works, and often what seems to be on the case. And in this case, she has maintained her innocence all the while. Now, her husband is not welcoming that news, a former husband, I must say, is not welcoming this news. So that tells another story there as well. Now, for our next news, we're going to the airlines. Meaning there are many times airlines cancel flights. Now, due to those cancellations, there are many consequences on many people who would have been on that flight. There are athletes who would have taken part in some of their competition. There are big business deals that had to be done, some appointments which got missed because of the cancelled flights, and it's a bad reflection on that person. And there's so much monetary loss as well. I know for sure one of the flights that got cancelled, it has affected us. Our granddaughter was going to Sydney to take part in a rock climbing competition, and the last flight got cancelled. So that means they put her in an early morning flight next day, which meant straight from the aircraft into the competition area. It does not. It takes a toll. The mental trauma as well resulted her in not doing as well as she would have. So should airlines be asked to compensate in situations like this?
Perth woman Janelle was looking forward to flying interstate for a family party, but Jetstar cancelled her flight, leaving her around $1,000 out of pocket.
2 hours before the flight was supposed to leave, I got a text message to say it had been fully cancelled.
The ACCC has found domestic airfares are getting cheaper due to lower demand from cash-strapped customers and falling fuel prices. But airlines are still making more money per customer than they were pre-COVID, and discount fares aren't as good as they used to be.
We do not think that effective competition is delivering the low prices that we should be seeing given the reduction in costs.
Qantas and Virgin continue to dominate, operating 94% of flights in April.
That tells us that the entry of and expansion of Rex and entry of Bonza is still at a very small level and insufficient to produce real competitive pressure on Qantas and Virgin.
Yes, but also 41% of passengers flew on routes that have 3 or more carriers offering a service. So that means people have more choice than they did before.
The watchdog also claims cancellation rates are way too high.
A number of the factors that can cause those cancellations and delays are frustratingly outside of the airline's control also.
If your flight is delayed by more than a few hours, you should be entitled to care and compensation, meals, accommodation if appropriate.
The consumer watchdog also wants a new complaints body created to hold the airlines to account and the power to award compensation. But the airline industry is pushing back, claiming that could result in higher airfares. Michael Atkin, ABC.
And of course they would, because they're looking at their end. And that lady, she got a message a few hours before. In our case, our granddaughter was at the airport, checked in when it was announced that the flight is now cancelled. No compensation, no food vouchers, no accommodation. Overnight, they had to catch a cab all the way out to the suburbs where they live, being out of pocket, not $1,000, much more than that. So, it is food for thought. as to what is here. Well, right now, let's go to South Australia. We'll look at few of the things. One is that South Australia passes harsher laws to crack down on protesters after disruptions.
This is what democracy looks like!
Last month, the Petroleum Conference in Adelaide drew protests by Extinction Rebellion. One climate activist brought traffic to a standstill by abseiling from a bridge. Another activist, Brad Homewood, defaced the office of oil and gas producer Santos.
We are in a climate and ecological emergency. There's not a social movement that has achieved anything without disruption, and that's all we're trying to do, and we're trying to do it for the benefit of everyone.
The same day Brad was arrested, the South Australian government introduced hastily drawn up legislative changes to crack down on disruptive protesters.
Those the opinions say aye, against no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it.
The changes increase the fine for obstructing a public place from $750 to a maximum $50,000 or 3 months jail. It's the harshest fine for such an offence in the nation.
We hadn't seen any update in these fines in a long, long time. I don't think $750 has acted as a deterrent whatsoever for this extreme form of behaviour.
These laws passed the lower house in 22 minutes, which is not even enough time to do a load of washing. There was no public consultation or even parliamentary scrutiny over these laws in the lower house, and that's not how you make good legislation.
Show me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like!
Human rights and other groups hit the streets to protest the crackdown. The state Labor government even found itself at odds with some unions over the changes.
Down with this bill! Down with this bill!
The right to peaceful assembly is protected under international law. It is a fundamental human right, coupled with the right to vote.
Do you consider abseiling off a bridge a peaceful protest?
I do consider someone who's abseiling off a bridge a peaceful protest, but we don't jail people just because they're being a little obstructive and maybe a little bit annoying. Jailing people or giving people a $50,000 fine for taking quite a peaceful action is incredibly excessive in the extreme.
But the Attorney General...
So there you are. As I said, there's always different schools of thoughts, and freedom of speech is a fundamental human right, as he rightfully said, and that is protected under international laws as well. Because there's crackdown from the international agencies onto countries where the freedom of speech, freedom of association is suppressed. But, of course, it has to be within reason, within means. And they said if the normal protest is not getting any results, abseiling of a bridge might. Well, for one, it has got a lot of attention, that much I must say. Whether it was the right thing or not to do, and whether the penalties that was imposed on the person was just or unjust. That's another matter. Well, ladies and gentlemen, right now, still remaining in South Australia, let's take a look at the weather condition as a thick fog, similar to ones in Delhi. That was enough to make you homesick, because that looked exactly what Delhi would look like in January and other things like that. Okay, so there's lots of commentaries on how and what happened in the Kathleen Folbig's case, and it will dominate the news for a while. But right now, we looked at the airlines. Right now, let's look at what our Prime Minister is saying on the face death penalty in Vietnam.
Prime Minister, welcome to 7:30.
Good to be back, Sarah.
And welcome back from your trip, I should say.
Indeed, it was a very successful trip to the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, and then the bilateral visit to Vietnam.
We'll come to that in a moment, but just on today, with the release of Kathleen Folbig, we've seen the reversal of an injustice as profound as that suffered by Lindy Chamberlain. As Prime Minister, do you have anything to say to Kathleen Folbig?
Well, this has been an extraordinary case where new evidence has led the Attorney-General of New South Wales, Michael Daly, to intervene and to pardon Ms Folbig. She's been in jail for some 20 years, and Michael Daly has chosen to show mercy and to intervene in this case. I think it is an extraordinary set of circumstances, and I am certain the obvious is that Kathleen Folbig will be very relieved today.
Now, you've just returned from a trip, as you said, to the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, a major defence event, but first you're back from Vietnam. There's been some work behind the scenes for Australian citizens detained in Vietnam. Was there any movement on their cases?
Well, there was a substantial breakthrough with the granting of clemency just yesterday for 2 Australians who had been sentenced to capital punishment. I made representations to the Prime Minister yesterday morning, and by yesterday afternoon the President had signed the clemency orders. Australia very much welcomes this. Australia, of course, has a strong position of opposition to the death penalty, and we make representations on behalf of Australian citizens, and we are very pleased that Vietnam has agreed to the request, and we thank them for it.
Now, in this case, we're not mentioning the names of those 2 individuals, but as you say, both of them face the death penalty in Vietnam. Have you spoken to their families since that clemency was obtained?
The families have been informed, and they are very relieved. They passed on their thanks to the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade officials who've been working on this for some time, but they are very much relieved today with this outcome. They have asked that their privacy be respected, which is why I am not mentioning the names this evening.
Do you understand what was decisive in this case? Because they've been pressing for clemency for some time. What changed?
Well, I think Australia is building a strong relationship with our ASEAN partners, and in particular with Vietnam, and the visit provided an impetus for this outcome. We as well have made representations on behalf of Chow Ben Kam, who was convicted of other offences. That's a different case. There we're after an international prisoner transfer, and we're hopeful in that case, but we'll continue to work on those issues. But we make representations, we do it diplomatically, and we always hope for positive outcomes in the interests of Australian citizens.
You've just returned from giving a major security speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. You talked there about the importance of guardrails between the US and China to prevent them stumbling into conflict. You said they must be beyond just principles or a set of ideals. What would those guardrails look like?
Well, what we know is that during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, there were systems set up so that a misadventure or a miscalculation didn't lead to disastrous consequences. The concern here is that the guardrails aren't in place. So the consequences of a misinterpretation or an accident occurring and it leading to a reaction and then a further action is something that is very dangerous. And what we want to recognise is that as a nation that wants peace, security and stability in our region, we think that both bilateral arrangements between major powers, but also engagement in multilateral forums are important as well.
Now, can you conceive of a role for the Australian government in formulating or being part of what these guardrails that you talk about that would prevent the kind of Cold War incidents from reoccurring?
Look, I think primarily that the guardrails need to be nation to nation so that communication can happen very directly and very clearly and very unequivocally. But Australia does have a role to play, and we are playing that role. We are engaging in the Pacific Island Forum. We're engaging with our ASEAN neighbours. Penny Wong, as Foreign Minister, has visited every single ASEAN nation, as well as every single nation that's a member of the Pacific Island Forum. We are very much engaged in our region, and we have a role to play. The fact that I've been invited again to attend the NATO summit in July as part of the Asia-Pacific 4 nations to do a separate presentation there. The fact that we're invited to give the keynote in front of the world's defence ministers of all the major powers were there in Singapore, I regard as recognition that Australia does have a significant role to play, given our history, given the upfront way in which we engage with our neighbours in the region and throughout the world.
But to be specific, in terms of ensuring the peace and in making sure that accidents don't occur that would be very dangerous in our region, are you talking about Australia having a specific role in ensuring those communications remained open?
I think we're having a role already by the fact that we are meeting with our Chinese counterparts on a ministerial to ministerial level, but also on a leader level. And of course, our alliance with the United States is one of the 3 pillars of our foreign policy, along with regional engagement and our support for multilateral forums. Peace can't be taken for granted. And the key to that, of course, is dialogue. The problem that had occurred is a breakdown in those relations, and that's why the US administration's call for increased dialogue with China is so important. It's one that we support, and it's one that we've encouraged China to participate in.
Can Australia be an intermediary when it's so tightly welded to the US military?
Well, we have an alliance with the United States that is an important part of our international framework and our foreign policy, and we don't shy away from that. The United States has an important role to play in this region as a Pacific power.
But if we're talking about...
So yes, as he mentioned that US has got a very, very important role to play even in our region, in the Asia-Pacific region and the world for that matter. And I think he did quite handle most of the questions quite well. Well, ladies and gentlemen, before we finish off this segment, let's take a look at the news in brief.
Kathleen Folbig has had her first night of freedom in 20 years after being released from prison and unconditionally pardoned over the deaths of her 4 children. A New South Wales judicial inquiry into her convictions found reasonable doubt about her guilt. Experts say it's likely her convictions will be quashed and that she could now seek compensation for wrongful imprisonment.
The Reserve Bank Board meets today with another interest rate rise up for consideration. After a pause in April, the RBA resumed its interest rate hikes in May, and many economists are today predicting a 12th increase in just over a year. An increase of 1/4 percentage point would take the official cash rate to 4.1%.
Former SAS soldier Ben Roberts-Smith has been labelled not honest and reliable in the full judgment of his multi-million-dollar defamation case. Federal Court Judge Anthony Basanko last week dismissed the case against 3 newspapers over a series of stories which called Ben Roberts-Smith a war criminal.
The federal government is urging Australians to be vigilant for heightened scam activity ahead of tax time. The Australian Taxation Office has already received more than 19,000 scam reports so far this financial year. Victims have given their information to scammers impersonating the ATO through phone calls and fake online links.
Something to be wary about. It could be quite taxing otherwise, trying to recover the money that you've already said. And I know, tax department at the moment is overwhelmed with so many people trying to catch up with this tax debts. And many small businesses also doing it really tough there in that sense. Well, ladies and gentlemen, for Newswise, that's about all we have for you in this segment. Right now, before we finish up, let's take a look at some of the functions and events taking place. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's about all we have time for you in this segment. Hi, it's been wonderful having your company. Apologies about yesterday, there being the press day. And of course, in the weekend, we had the GoPure Queensland's fundraising dinner, and what a successful event that was. We'll bring to you some glimpses of that later in the week as well. But for now, it's time to say goodbye. It's been wonderful having your company. And as I mentioned before, if you have anything that you'd like to discuss on the show, you're quite welcome to do so. Just get in touch with us, and we can bring you in via our video link, or better still, if you can come into the studios and we can discuss whatever you have to discuss with any message that you'd like to get out to the wider community. Until tomorrow, it's goodbye from us.